It's a great privilege to be at the John Innes Centre, which I understand is one of the world's leading plant research institutes, certainly one of the leading ones in Europe, and it's a great privilege to be here. We're going to discuss this very interesting and important topic of the world's increasing population and how we feed it. And so not only do we have the privilege of being here, but I have the privilege of having three very distinguished people with me who know far more about this topic than I do. And I'll start off by Professor Cathie Martin, who's a professor at the University of East Anglia. She's a group leader at the John Innes Centre here. She's too modest to admit, but I think she's probably one of the world's leading plant scientists. Anyhow, we're very, very grateful for your being here. And I now have on her right Dr. Charles Clutterbuck. He's a writer, he's an authority on the environment, he's on the Food Ethics Council, which is a very impressive title, I thought. And what interested me enormously was that he was on the government advisory board on pesticides. And I also see that from his CV that he's got 3 degrees in agricultural science, which I thought was very impressive.
It's almost impossible to get now because
yes.
there aren't the institutes there.
No, well done. Anyhow. So that was jolly good, and thank you for coming. And now also I have, I'm very pleased to say, Rupert Reid, who is a member of the Green Party. He is a reader in philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He's a Green Party councillor for Norwich City Council. Anyhow, I wonder if I could start by asking Cathie if you'd like to make some suggestions as to how things can be solved, because we're well aware, you see, of the, I'm afraid, starvation. Every day we read of some countries starving around the world, don't we? And we read of some crisis, there's flooding and one thing or another, and
so
think about these
I
things.
think the question of food security is actually very complicated. So it consists of, first of all, thinking how to feed the world as it will be. We're 9 billion people at the moment, and we're going to increase, I think, another 50% by 2050.
I know, it's frightening, isn't it?
And somehow agriculture's got to keep up with feeding us that way. But we also, and we have to do that in a more sustainable way, because we won't have any more land to be able to devote to growing food. So we have to think about ways that can be done so that we're more efficient on the use of water and generally more sustainable. And I think there's another often ignored component in the food security debate, and that is that food security is equated to sufficient healthy food for all. And people tend to miss out the idea of healthy food. But this is really, really important, because many people in developed countries are actually classified as being food insecure, because although they have access to adequate food, they don't have access to adequate healthy food for a healthy life. So many of the chronic diseases that we suffer from today and that are increasing in incidence are caused by obesity, and that's caused by eating poor quality, low quality food. So I'm very enthusiastic to try and think of ways that we can improve the quality of the food that we eat to address this hidden dimension to food security as well.
How incredibly important. Charles, would you like to?
I agree with everything that Cathie said, except for one thing. And just to confirm what she said about linking health and the environment together. I took of sustainable food being that which is healthier for both people and the planet.
Yes.
And we do have to address the issue of how we not only feed people but stop people eating rubbish.
Yes.
And I worked for the World Health Organization in Africa on an education program for their governments to work out how they can feed their populations better. And in the WHO we call it the double burden. That parallel to the starvation, about 1 billion people going hungry, there's about 1 billion people obese. And
I know, it's absurd, isn't it?
Yes, and I think what we have to do is, why is that?
Yes.
Try and understand why that is. And my difficulty is that when I was brought up from about the age of 12, I wanted to feed the world. I steered myself through the education system to feed the world. Hence my career. But then realised that it isn't as simple as just producing more food. That's the problem. Just what happens, we're encouraged to produce more food, we produce more food, and then what happens? night follows day. The markets dictate what happens. You can ask any farmer if they produce more food, and the next farmer produces more food, and there's a fabulous bumper harvest. What happens? The price plummets. Yeah. Ditto, if there's not enough, then the price goes up, and that's what we're in the middle of at the moment.
20 years ago, a friend of mine was talking about having food banks around the world, which I thought was a brilliant idea.
Yes. Well, there should. Yes.
When there was a grain mountain, all sorts of things. He said, "Why don't you have a food bank in Africa and a food bank somewhere else?"
We're beginning to say the same again now, because because what's happening now is it's much more volatile. I think that would be the best description of it.
Yes.
We talk about the price hikes of 2007, 2008. And then what happened was people went back into farming more. This is where the disagreement I'll have with Cathie is that there is more land out there to farm properly. A lot of it is not farmed properly. And I've just driven across the country and I can tell you which is and which isn't. You know, the land round here is amazingly farmed, isn't it?
Oh, it's
efficient.
The grain basket of England.
Yes, but as soon as you get up past York and then over the Pennines, you're into a completely different agriculture.
Different climate.
Different climate, different agriculture, different investment. Yeah. And I can point out land around there which is not being used properly. In the last
land.
No, it's not arable, it's all grassy, you see. Yeah. But you can see, I can see in the last 5 years, I can point out pasture after pasture which has gone downhill is now rushes. Oh, yes. I can point out where there were cows, there are now horses. Well, you know, horses wreck the land and they don't contribute very much to the sustainable food.
Well, of course, we've had the milk price problem, haven't we?
Yeah,
they've all gone out of dairying.
So we shouldn't be seeing all land as the same. You know, let's sort of say there's different problems and different issues. Yeah. And what my concern is, some land is invested in and some land is not invested in, and that's the problem. But I'm beginning to.
Well, we'd love to hear what you think about this, Rupert. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm sympathetic with what Cathie said and with what Chris has said. I guess my main disagreement with Chris would be that I'm not so happy, or to put it a bit more bluntly, complacent about the state of farming in a place like East Anglia. I think that a lot of the way that we're farming today in a place like East Anglia is extremely unsustainable. I think we're producing a lot of long-term damage to the soil, and we're losing a lot of topsoil. And I think we need to engage in some radical, serious rethinking of our farming methods. And I'm really interested in some of the experimental new ways of farming, which I've seen and experienced, for example, here in East Anglia, which I think are showing a way to the future. For example, agroforestry, where what you do basically is you grow crops in between lines of trees. And it's very good for reducing incidence of disease. It's very good for reducing loss of topsoil. It's very good for enriching topsoil. You can get incredibly high yields. I think we ought to be thinking of and putting money into a lot more of such genuinely radical, forward-looking, innovative methods which are not heavily reliant on unsustainable inputs of chemicals or of potentially dangerous GM technologies.
So what is damaging the soil, do you think, in East Anglia? Do you think it's the chemicals?
Well, that's one of the things that's damaging the soil.
Continuous cereal cropping?
Yeah, and continuous use of very heavy machinery. There's a number of causes.
You're getting compaction?
There's a number of causes of this kind of problem, and reduction in the quality of humus. There's all sorts of things going on, which things like agroforestry, as one example, offer a potential way around, it seems to me. In terms of where I disagreed with Cathie, it's a kind of nuanced disagreement. I'm all in favour of food security, but I think that food security isn't really enough. I think we need to take a step further into what's now being called food sovereignty. The problem with what people call food security, they say, well, you need to be able to have secure sources of food, and it sort of doesn't matter where they are. As long as you can get hold of them or buy them or whatever, is typically what people say. We've got chronically long supply lines in the world today. We need to move to a system of food production which is far, far more localized, where nations and regions and localities are mostly self-reliant. And that is what's meant by food sovereignty. Another aspect of this is that if we're talking about feeding the world, one of the main problems in the world at the moment in terms of feeding the substantial population that we have is that there are a lot of poor people around the world who lack food security, let alone food sovereignty, because of the way in which, as was mentioned in terms of volatility of prices, their staple crops are in danger of being ripped away from them or ripped out of their purchasing power level if they don't have enough money to buy them, if the price spikes. So one of the key things we need to be doing, I think, is encouraging farmers in those parts of the world to move out of the big export cash crops and the mega sort of staples like wheat and rice into things which are not traded so much and which are less liable, therefore, to enter into this worldwide speculation system, which is so utterly deforming our food system at the moment. I mean, we don't really have a food production system at the moment in the world. What we have is a profit production system that bases itself on food, and that's, in the final analysis, what needs to change.
But you can only, you see, I mean, how do you administer all this? I mean, it's frankly, it sounds quite a good idea, but is it actually practical? I mean, countries will do as they wish, won't they? The United Nations have only got to recommend something, the country pleases itself. I was thinking about the poor people of Syria at this moment. What on earth are they living